The sound of metal scraping concrete is never supposed to belong to a president. Not New York. Not anywhere. I'm Caitlin Collins. And when Nicolás Maduro walked into that courtroom in leg shackles, something far bigger than a trial began unfolding. This wasn't just a man in custody. This was a former symbol of power, standing still while the world decided what he is now. Maduro didn't argue the charges first. He didn't ask for mercy. He said he'd been kidnapped. He called himself a prisoner of war. And in that moment, two realities collided inside one room. To the judge, he was a defendant. To himself, he was still a head of state. To the world watching, he was something far more unsettling, a warning. If you think this story is only about Venezuela, don't look away. Because what happens when power loses its shield matters to every nation and every leader. And to understand why this moment feels so dangerous, we have to start with one simple question. Who decides when power ends? What you're watching here isn't just a courtroom drama. It's a collision between law and power, between sovereignty and force. Because the real question isn't whether Nicolás Maduro committed the crimes he's accused of. That will be argued later. The deeper question is this: how did a sitting president end up here at all? Inside that courtroom, the US justice system treated Maduro like any other defendant. Confirm your name, enter your plea, listen through the headphones. But outside that room, the implications stretch far wider. A foreign leader arrested at home, transferred across borders, placed in shackles under US authority. Maduro says he was kidnapped. The United States says this is accountability. Both sides are telling a story, and both stories are aimed at the world. This isn't just about Venezuela. It's about what happens when global power decides that titles no longer protect you. To understand how we reached this point, how this became possible, we need to go back before the courtroom, back before the arrest. To understand how this moment became possible, we have to look at the sequence, not the politics behind it, but the mechanism itself. According to what unfolded, this didn't begin in a courtroom. It began overnight, at a private compound in Venezuela, with US forces moving in, arrests made, and military bases struck almost simultaneously. This wasn't gradual. It wasn't negotiated. It was sudden, coordinated, and decisive. By the time the world woke up, Nicolás Maduro and his wife were already gone, transferred in custody, on their way to New York. And that speed matters. Because power, especially political power, usually erodes slowly through elections, through protests, through legitimacy, slipping away over years. But this was different. This was power interrupted. One day, Maduro was in Caracas. The next, he was standing before a federal judge, asked to confirm his name. That contrast, the immediacy of it, is what makes this moment feel so destabilizing. And it set the stage for the first real shock inside that courtroom. That's where things began to fracture. The first fracture came quietly, and then all at once. Maduro didn't rage. He didn't posture. He stood there, calm, measured, and said the words that changed the temperature in the room. I am the president of the Republic of Venezuela, and I am here kidnapped. In a federal courtroom in New York, that statement landed like a fault line. Because it wasn't just a defense, it was a challenge. The judge cut him off. There would be a time and a place for that, he said. The law needed to move forward, but the damage was already done. In 40 minutes, two systems collided. One built on titles, borders, and sovereignty. The other built on charges, procedure, and control. Maduro pleaded not guilty. So did his wife. Innocent, they said. Decent people, wrongly taken. And as those words echoed, the room absorbed something else, the realization that this wasn't just about what Maduro had done, it was about whether power itself could be put on trial. If you're still watching, pause for a moment and ask yourself why this scene feels so unsettling. Because the answer unlocks what's really happening beneath the surface. What sits beneath all of this, beneath the statements, the interruptions, the legal formalities, is a system most people never see. Because this wasn't just an arrest. It was a signal. In moments like this, power doesn't disappear. It gets reclassified. Inside the courtroom, Nicolás Maduro wasn't addressed as a president. He was processed as a defendant. That shift didn't happen emotionally. It happened procedurally. That's the mechanism. Once a leader is pulled into a foreign legal system, Titles stop carrying weight. The law doesn't argue legitimacy. It ignores it. Headphones replace podiums. Shackles replace motorcades. A yellow legal pad replaces executive orders. And that's why this moment matters. Because it reveals how modern power is neutralized not through speeches or sanctions alone, but through jurisdiction. This isn't about humiliation, it's about control. When sovereignty collides with a system that doesn't recognize it, only one structure survives. And once that door opens, it doesn't just apply to one man, it becomes a template. And the consequences of that template became impossible to ignore moments later. The second surge of tension didn't come from the bench. It came from the room itself. As the proceedings moved forward, something broke through the controlled calm. A voice from the public gallery shouted that Maduro would pay for his crimes. It was sudden, raw, unscripted. Maduro spun toward the sound. And for the first time, the mask cracked. "I am a president," he shouted back, "and a prisoner of war." Those words weren't meant for the judge. They weren't meant for the prosecution. They were meant for history. Because in that outburst, the conflict became visible. Not legal versus illegal, but narrative versus narrative. One man was escorted out in tears. Another stood in shackles, insisting on a title the room no longer recognized. That's the second crisis. When authority stops being acknowledged by the system enforcing control, what remains is only belief. And belief, under pressure, turns volatile. In that moment, the courtroom wasn't just a place of law. It became a stage for competing truths. And while the law moved on, the human cost of this collision was only beginning to surface. That's where this story turns personal. Now I want you to shift your focus away from the courtroom, away from the headlines. Because while power was being debated in that room, real lives were absorbing the impact. If you were watching closely, you saw it in the details. Maduro's wife, quieter than him, bandages near her eyes and forehead. Lawyers asking for medical scans, x-rays, possible fracture. You saw it in the voice of a Venezuelan reporter sitting in the same room. She wasn't there as an observer alone. She said the missile strikes during the arrest damaged her family's home. And if you're listening to this as a viewer, you need to understand something. When geopolitics moves fast, it never moves cleanly. You don't live in courtrooms, you live in homes. Near bases, near decisions made far away. And that's why this moment matters to you. Because when power collapses suddenly, ordinary people feel it first, in fear, in loss, in silence. If this story makes you uncomfortable, it should. Stay with me, because what happens next doesn't stop at borders. What happened in that courtroom didn't stay in that room. Because when a head of state is arrested this way, the shock doesn't travel inward, it travels outward. Across borders, across alliances, across every government watching quietly and taking notes. This wasn't just a message to Venezuela. It was a message to the world. A signal that power, even at the highest level, can be overridden by force and jurisdiction. That sovereignty is conditional. And that protection depends on who is enforcing the rules. Other leaders saw it immediately, not on television, but in strategy rooms, in military briefings, in diplomatic silence. Because if this can happen to one president, it reshapes calculations everywhere. Who is untouchable? Who isn't? This moment feeds uncertainty. It hardens alliances. It deepens mistrust between nations that already see the world through opposing lenses. And once that uncertainty sets in, it doesn't fade quickly. It compounds. The arrest of one man becomes a stress test for the global order itself. And that brings us to the most difficult question of all. What happens next? From here, the future doesn't move in a straight line. It fractures. Based on what we've seen, there are 3 paths forward, and none of them are simple. The first is the controlled outcome. The legal process continues. The case proceeds quietly. The courtroom absorbs the shock, and the world adjusts. Maduro becomes a symbol of accountability, a message that power has limits, but the system holds. The second path is instability. Legal proceedings drag on. Narratives harden. Supporters and opponents outside the courtroom turn this case into a rallying cry, not just about one man, but about sovereignty, intervention, and retaliation. Then there's the third path, the most dangerous one, where this moment is remembered not as justice, but as precedent, where leaders begin acting defensively, where power consolidates faster, harder, and with less transparency out of fear of the same fate. That's how systems change, not overnight, but through moments like this. Moments where the rules appear flexible and force appears decisive. And once that belief takes hold, it reshapes behavior everywhere. Which leaves us with one final reckoning, not about Maduro, but about us watching. That's where this story ends. This story doesn't end with a verdict, it ends with a mirror. Because what you witnessed wasn't just the fall of one man. It was a glimpse of how power is treated in this moment of history. Nicolás Maduro stood in a courtroom and insisted he was still a president. The system around him didn't argue. It simply moved on. That silence is the insight. In today's world, power doesn't vanish in dramatic speeches. It dissolves when it stops being recognized. When the rules change quietly, and enforcement replaces legitimacy. That should make you pause. Not because of who Maduro is, but because of what this moment normalizes. If leaders can be reduced to defendants overnight, the global order is no longer abstract. It's fragile, conditional, and closer to you than you think. If this analysis helped you see that shift more clearly, stay here. Share this, because the next story won't start in a courtroom. It will start before anyone realizes the rules have changed.